Okay, so this is a SAFPAC monthly seminar. I'm very pleased that Peter Nevins, who I once trained with, years ago, Peter's subsequently trained at the site and was one of the originators of the site for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. And Peter's going to talk about thinking psychoanalysis differently. I think there's a whole, is that right? That's the kind of yeah. I mean, I think there is a kind of issue, is, you know, when does psychoanalysis help thinking? When does it stop thinking? Maybe we'll hear a bit more about that. Hopefully, we'll see what happens. Peter,
Okay. Hello, everybody online. Okay. So, first of all, just a bit of a preamble. I'm not going to. There's nothing. I'm not going to claim to be the originator of anything that I'm about to say. It's a collection of thoughts, rather, that I have been interested in, come from my own experience and my reading and whatnot. So I'm not sitting here being the one who knows everything and be able to answer all the questions afterwards. I'm not doing. But I'm indebted in this to a guy called Lewis Gordon, who from whom I got the idea of using a piece of narrative to kind of illustrate what I'm trying to convey. And it came from a book he wrote called Existentia Africana, and one of the chapters is called Frederick Douglass as a existentialist. And Frederick Douglass was a former slave who wrote several autobiographical accounts of his life as a slave. And in one of them, he describes a fight that he had with what would be like a overlord, or what they call them. The lead up to this fight, and the fight itself, was a turning point in Frederick Douglass's emergence as a human subject, as opposed to a piece of property. And Lewis Gordon uses the context of that fight to illustrate existentialism as a live thing. And I really, really like that idea. So although I'm not Lewis Gordon, I'm going to have a little go at doing something similar. I'm only going to speak for about 35, 40 minutes. I know you, Dale told me with an hour and a half an hour questions, but I'm much more interested in the conversation than just a year reading something. I find it tedious listening to somebody for an hour talking. Just go in on this conversation. We learn more from the conversation. So that's the kind of context in which we're talking. But also, you know, I do have a kind of overt political project, which is to bring as many black thinkers into the conversation that we all have, whether it's about psychoanalysis, whether it's phenomenology or existentialism, biology, whatever. You know, I find it very important to bring those voices into the conversation. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Wonderful.
So I want to start by thinking of some what might call meeting points between phenomenology and psychoanalysis. I mean, it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek exercise, but might be interesting nonetheless. I mean, one such meeting point is the idea that phenomenology appears always to be beginning, and psychoanalysis never seems to end. Because phenomenology is concerned with experience and the experiencing of experience. It is always on the move. One finds it hard to identify a beginning, a place where it starts. As every moment is an experience, of a moment, and that moment itself contains lots of preceding moments. And the idea of psychoanalysis never seeming to have an ending kind of reflects the difficulty of determining, or a lack of desire to determine, what would, in the end, look like a cure. And I want to just give a little quote here from Adam Phillips in his book, Psychoanalytic Cure. He says, Freud's inspired follower, Ferenczi, famously wrote, "The patient is not cured by free association, he is cured when he can free associate." Lacan said, the analyst starts explaining when he becomes frightened of his curiosity. Psychoanalysis, Leon suggests, should be practiced without memory and desire. The aim of psychoanalysis, Winnicott says, is that the patient should be able to surprise themselves. With these aims and objectives, no epistemology of the process of cure is possible, because there is no knowing beforehand what is there to be said, or felt, or found, or used. In both these cases, when phenomenology appears to be always beginning, and psychoanalysis appears never to have an end, each, though, taps into the open-ended character of life that allows one to recognize movement and change. Another point of contact might be those of existence and the unconscious. It is more useful to say that they constitute two styles of approaching the meaning of being human, insofar as both are defining features of what distinguishes human beings from non-human beings. For psychoanalysis, there is the unconscious, the contents of which are typically hidden or inaccessible, while for phenomenology, the elements of existence are typically taken for granted or non-thematized. In both cases, the method is to bring these contents into the light of day and understand their consequences for people's lives. Yet another point of convergence might be that the phenomenological technique of imaginative variation and the psychoanalytic technique of free association, where the task of imaginative variation is to seek possible meanings through the use of our imagination and approaching the phenomena from divergent perspectives, different positions, in order to concentrate on the phenomena of interest reduced to its existential core. And free association requires the patient to concentrate on her immediate state of emotional sensibility. What I have discovered for myself about incorporating a phenomenological sensibility into my approach to the psychoanalysis I practice has great value across my work with all my patients, but specifically when working with those who are disenfranchised by various forms of oppression. I was very fortunate to undergo a training which equipped me to think beyond traditional psychoanalytic paradigms and to think more broadly philosophically about the work we do, and indeed incorporate this wider thinking into a way of thinking psychoanalysis differently. When I was thinking of writing something for this seminar, I automatically, as I do, tried to think of clinical vignettes I could use, but then became concerned about the ethics of using material that might identify a patient even to themselves, and particularly when we're using kind of blended forums like Zoom, whatever. You don't know where it's going to end up. So I decided against this approach. But something happened to me recently, which was so unexpected and clinically interesting that I thought I would use myself as a clinical vignette. It was an experience which I think examples how racism works and the impact it has on our, or at least my, mind and psychic experience. And the telling illustrates the phenomenological approach in practice. The experience of race and racism, being an experience I cannot escape, makes it a fitting subject for this exploration. So in the middle of August last year, as we've heard it now, but not so long ago, I lost my passport and had to apply for a new one. This, on the face of it, seemed like a straightforward exercise. After all, I had probably had 4 passports over the years. I got the application form from the post office, began to complete it. Section 4 knocked me back completely, and I had to read it several times before I felt sure what it was asking. Because in section 4, it states, if either parent named below were born on or after 1st of January 1983, or were born outside the UK, you will need to give the full name, the town, country, date of birth, and the marriage of your grandparents, or details of your parents' claim to British nationality. Section 8 on a separate paper. The guidance notes said at the side said you must complete this section if you are applying for a lost, stolen, or damaged passport, which I was. Well, at 62 years of age, my father died 22 years ago. I don't know the details of his parents, nor can I prove his claim to British nationality. Now, this threw me into an hysterical and I might say existential panic. I frantically contacted my mother and asked her for her details and if she had any of my father's details. She gave me passport details and my father's passport details, which as someone who never throws anything away, thankfully she still had. But this wasn't enough. I needed his parents' details too. And I certainly didn't have them, nor did she. I'm now in a panic with worry. I couldn't sleep. I was convinced that I was going to be deported on the next plane to Kingston, Jamaica, if I didn't have all of what they wanted, my grandparents' details and details of their marriage. I wouldn't be able to get a passport. I was going to be deported. There was no doubt in my mind about this. But another part of my mind knew that this was nonsense. I was born here. I'd had several passports before. What on earth was I getting so worked up about? But rationalise as I might, it didn't make any difference to how I felt and the terror of what I was imagining was going to happen to me. I had made an appointment at the passport office, and on the night before the appointment, I couldn't sleep, and eventually I got up about 4 o'clock in the morning and read and reread the application form to ensure that I had completed everything correctly and I really understood what they were asking for in section 4. And indeed, they were asking for my grandparents' details. I felt sick in my stomach, and I was sure I would be subject to intense scrutiny at the passport office. I really was going to be deported. How could this be? I was born in Whittington Hospital in Manchester in November 1960. But I didn't have the information they were asking for. Of course, everybody around me was saying, don't be silly, of course there won't be a problem. But this is not how I felt. So I had feelings of foreshortened future. I was about to be carted off to Jamaica and then subject to homophobic terror resulting in my death. I had, for those few days, difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep. And I became hypervigilant. Everybody was about to get me. I was losing my marbles, as they say. On the way to the appointment, I remember being frantically worried that I had left my keys at home, when in fact they were in the ignition of the scooter I was riding. Any psychologist in the room will surely recognise these as symptoms of PTSD. I knew that my response to this was both exaggerated and startled, but I also had no doubt about what was going to happen to me. I couldn't shift it, the feeling that I was under attack, now and forever. I couldn't believe what was about to befall me. The toxic environment, or aggressive environment, or whatever it is they were doing, their hostile environment, got right inside me. I felt sick as a dog and paranoid as one can get. So I arrived at the passport office for my appointment. The place was quiet and calm, and I still felt sick. I waited a short 5 or 10 minutes for my appointment. I kept looking at the number sequence of this queuing system, even at that point worrying that the fact that my number wasn't there indicated that some other arrangements would be. I was called to the booth. I had with me so many proofs of who I was: my birth certificate, my civil partner certificate, a very old expired passport, proofs of my address, all in a neat folder. The man behind the counter took my application form, my signed photographs, checked a few boxes on the form, and said, "Thank you, that's it. You'll get your new passport within the next 7 days." I still couldn't believe it, so I asked him if he could tell me whether what I had provided in relation to Section 4 was enough, as it didn't include anything about my grandparents. He nicely went on to explain that obviously this didn't apply to me. I was already on the system, so was my father, so this question didn't apply. It was there because of the 1983 Immigration Act, which determined that being born in the UK wasn't enough any longer to establish nationality. Don't worry, he said. Don't worry. At the age of 62, and having worked through all this stuff in many years of therapy, and having learned a great deal from all of my patients and supervisees, don't worry. Having, in my terms, a successful life, I was made to feel like shit. And I did feel like shit. Felt that tomorrow was the last day of my life. And all my psychoanalytic and psychological understanding and self-reflection had no influence whatsoever in that moment. So what intrigues me, and I thought would be useful to contemplate here, is what we, as psychoanalysts, can do with this. And so I think about my psychoanalytic practice and how I might respond or think with a patient who presented to me with this kind of story. I recognise that my experience was both extreme and short-lived. But there are patients for whom this is a common experience and one that they live with all the time. The trauma lives in them now and forever. So thinking more broadly about psychoanalysis and thinking with the many philosophical discourses that I have been exposed to over the years, and thinking about race and racism, and thinking about my attachment to psychoanalysis, and thinking about the conundrums and the contradictions that all of this brings, I've come to understand that, in my practice at least, what is useful is to develop an attitude towards psychoanalysis, one which incorporates both the philosophies of phenomenology and, for me, American pragmatism. I see in them a possibility of expanding our psychoanalytic horizon, and a hope of bringing this phenomenological and pragmatic attitude to our work in order to, as I said earlier, think psychoanalysis differently. What is the issue here is the convergence of a phenomenological sensibility and attunement to the immediacy of experience. Also, we should remain cognizant that phenomenology does not require a different kind of data, but is a manner or a style of thinking. That's the point. Phenomenology seeks to examine the nature of the world as experienced, whatever the object of inquiry might be, including oneself, one's thoughts, one's experience of others. In other words, instead of applying a theory that presumes to account for what is happening in the patient when is analysing, a phenomenological approach goes directly to the person themselves by examining their own experiences of their relationship to the matter in hand. This is not a matter of speculation, but of determining the ground of experience at the moment it is transformed through the interhuman bond shared with others. I understand the very formation of the subject is constituted by a trauma, an interruption that forms the very conditions for the subject to come into being. A succession of trauma, oppressions if you like, reignite the structure of one's subjecthood and occasions a multiplicity of subject positions that both produce and inaugurate complex and interwoven identities. We do not come with timeless truths. A quote from Franz Fanon, the introduction to his seminal book, Black Skin, White Mass. Of course, phenomenology itself resists definition, because like experience itself, its method is antithetical to theoretical and causal explanation. Its point of departure here is its rejection of the conceptualizing tendencies of most traditional psychoanalytic theorizing. And the kind of psychoanalysis I am interested in is the kind that places the experiential world at the forefront of our analytic endeavors. Phenomenology shares with psychoanalysis the view that explanation is inadequate to the task of understanding what is given to experience, and shares with psychoanalysis the task of determining the peculiar and inherently ambiguous nature of suffering itself. This feature of phenomenology, that the object of experience can never be decisively separated from the subject who experiences it, is both intentional and intersubjective, because my experience of the other is always unremittingly mine, with all its attendant ambiguity and baggage. Phenomenology works for me because it is concerned with the experience of things as they are. The phenomenological method, as I understand it, entails the notion of self-experience, of reflection, and a recognition that one's lived experience constructs one's perception of the world and the production of meaning which follows from such a perception, a construction. It was Maurice Merleau-Ponty who held that perception of an object is not possible without taking into account the conscious meaning attributed to that object. So, for example, race as an object cannot be perceived without taking into account the conscious meaning we attribute to it. Also, according to Merleau-Ponty's perspective, it makes no sense to think of the world of objects and subjects as separate from our experience of them. This is because the experience of an object depends upon our perception of it, and perceptual appearance varies depending upon perceive as mental orientation. For example, their desires, their wishes, their judgments, their emotions, their aims and purposes. He held that self-consciousness not only includes one ability to make reflective judgments, but also the capability of experiencing the other as doing something, that is, as an embodied agent. I exist in a world, first and foremost, as a being of the world from which I cannot extricate myself. The person I take myself to be is essentially an invention that I have a hand in creating. But the greater part of my self-authorship derives from what others make of me. However, who I take myself to be is not just rooted in the past. I'm also constantly in the making, every waking moment of my life. Drawing on Merleau-Ponty for inspiration again, one might say that perceptual practices involved in racialization are tacit, unspoken, almost hidden from view, and thus immune from hypercritical reflection. And this brings me to pragmatism. Pragmatism, American pragmatism frame. So the pragmatic method tries to interpret each notion by tracing its respective practical consequences. And I think this is integral to the work we do in the consulting group. Tracing the practical consequences of the issues that our patients bring to us is the heart of the matter. And what they want to do about it seems to me to be the conversation that takes place all the time. Allowing ourselves and our patients to be open to a variety of possibilities without being bound by our own or our patients' habits. For example, the habits that make up our identity as psychoanalysts. By habit, I mean the conscious predisposition to transact with our physical, social, political, and natural world, including the habit of making race. All these habits can be questioned. They are not set in stone. In many ways, pragmatism can unstiffen our theories. We do not enter the consulting room in a vacuum. We bring with us our own life experience. And this reminds me of the depth of my experience described earlier. It's not simply a matter of our everyday experiences, because they incorporate the ideologies and discursive practices that surround us and that become embedded in our being. Our beliefs about ourselves are drawn from a history composed of previous beliefs, modified through time and utility. To quote Charles Mills, a Jamaican philosopher, he says, "The social ontology of a racialized body politic becomes incarnated in the bodies of its members, fleshed out in the reactive behavior. Socialized from birth to discern race, we learn to apprehend the world through a grid whose architecture has been shaped on a blueprint, still functioning independent of our will and intent." End quote. By social ontology, he means the study of the nature and properties of the social world, as it's concerned with analysing the various entities in the world that arise from social interaction. So the impact of this then is prime material for psychoanalysis. If you think about the material impact of all this, one can see, again with a quote from a black thinker, a woman called Hortense Spiller, The major topics of psychoanalysis are stringently operative in black communities. Things like self-division, the mimetic and transitive character desire, the economies of displacement, the paradox of the life and death pull, the tragic elements couched in the transfer of social powers, one generation of historical actors to the other, the paradox of the negative, the preeminent distinction that's attached to the twin towers of human and social being, mother and father. The life world offers a quintessential occasion for a psychoanalytic reading. End of quote. On hope is that the exploration of psychoanalytic ideas through a phenomenological lens in the consulting room have evolved from being understood as purely intrapsychic defences to being understood within intersubjective and transgenerational clinical theories. And as a result, the experience of the patient can become more embedded in the thinking of psychoanalysts. Now, just back to the experience I described earlier. The truth of the matter is that I was right to believe the horrible possibilities described above, because a part of me knew and understood that racism would kill me, and has done so for many black people before me. The worst can happen, and already has happened. It is unpredictable. It can happen any moment, with or without my agency. But it is also true that I was paranoid and traumatized by the passport experience. I'd like to quote Richard Rorty, American pragmatist philosopher. He says, Freud gave us a new technique for achieving genuinely stable character. Achieving a genuinely stable character. The technique of lending a sympathetic ear to our own tendencies to instability by treating them as alternative ways of making sense of the past, ways that have as good a claim on our attention as do the familiar beliefs and desires that are available to introspection. This mechanistic view of the self gave us a vocabulary that lets us describe all the various parts of the soul, conscious and unconscious alike, in homogeneous terms, as equally plausible candidates for the true self. The grip of the symbolism of the statement in question 4 of the passport application represents more than just a simple request, but opened up a sequence of intergenerational trauma memories that became operative right there and then. And this is prime material for reflection. But the longer story is also there to be explored. One of my parents' experience of racism. What impact did it have on their raising of their children, or even their belief of it being possible to raise children safely? A black couple, a black and white couple in 1960s Manchester. My father's experience, leaving Jamaica as a young man, his reasons for doing it, and his experience when he arrived here. How did that translate to his relationship to rearing his children? And before that, the lived experience of the colonial subject. And before that, the non-human experience of slavery. And now, the non-human experience that was mine in that passport office. All rich territory for exploration. We live in a time and a place where a hostile environment is both operative and condoned by our government. two branches of the answer. A reflection on the validity of all this as an experience and a resistance to the pathologies of paranoia and delusion, which often cancel this experience. Third, in my view, be a much more useful way to make sense of our traumatic moments and enable the patient, me, to unhook themselves from the messages of being wronged. And to quote poet Julie Jordan, the wrong skin colour, the wrong sex, the wrong sexual identity, the wrong age, the wrong nose, the wrong hair, the wrong need, the wrong dream, the wrong geographic, the wrong sartorial eye. And I'll end with a quote from Richard Rorty. The best way of tinkering with ourselves is to tinker with something else.
Sorry, can you repeat the last?
The best way of tinkering with ourselves is to tinker with something else. So that's it.
Well, for now, thank you.
For now, well, that's the start. Now, you know, like I said before, I'm certainly interested in questions, of course.
Good.
So I don't know whether I can answer them. And
Okay.
I
Well,
would like it to be much more of a conversation.
thanks very much for starting the conversation. Thank you. So, thoughts, questions, comments, statements?
One of the things, can I just say, one of the things I was thinking about, and I've thought about quite a lot, but I was just thinking about it on the train here, and I was reminded of it. And it's a kind of way of encapsulating what some of the issue might be for me. I was supervising some trainees at another place at another time, and this trainee was describing her first encounter with the patient. And this patient was a middle age, probably, or I don't know what mid-30s is. Black woman from the West Indies, single mother, 4 or 5 kids, and had various and several violent relationships, and her own mother was violent to her, and her own stepfather was disappeared and problematic. The woman had no money. She was living precariously in various environments. And, you know, if it was a film, if that was kind of a film, you'd be saying, you know, that's stereotyping black people. You can't tell that story. You know, it was kind of that was her story. And after the person told us all this, she then said, you see, I was wondering, is she psychotic or neurotic? And I mean, you know, the woman was well-intentioned. She's into Hegelian theories, and she kind of wanted to play it out. But I was completely dumbfounded by the comment after hearing this kind of horror story. And all I could say at the time was, well, I'm sure Lacan wasn't thinking about people who had their experience when he came to their experience. That's all I could say at the time. But it kind of, thinking about it in relation to, you know, thinking about the lack of capacity in that moment to be able to think about that woman's experience, to be able to explore with what that woman's experience meant to her, was completely out of the picture because this particular person was locked in a series of psychoanalytic theories, which she had to somehow fit this woman into. And so the woman's story gets completely sidelined.
What you're saying is phenomenology before psychoanalysis, don't it's phenomenology into psychoanalysis.
Yeah. That's right.
Is there something in that you were talking about the humanisation of how you felt, and that response, is it psychosis or neurosis, is a kind of dehumanisation of the person and what it might have felt like for that woman with all those experiences. It's almost like a human taken out of it, and all that's abstracted are these kind of labels and things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of diagnosing anyway in and of itself is really problematic for precisely those reasons. But what struck me was not so much that. I mean, I hear people fumbling and mumbling over diagnosis all the time, and it wasn't that struck me. It was the complete separation from this enormous story was told to us all in the room, which we all had feelings about. You can't not have feelings when you hear that story. But it was completely written out of the picture when it came to her trying to think psychoanalytically about it.
I think sometimes,
As if the two can't go together.
yeah, I think sometimes theory is used as a defence against being overwhelmed. It's a way to try to find a way through, being impacted by someone else's traumatic experience. It's so overwhelming that sometimes you might use theory as some way to distance yourself from the pain of it. So it might be her defence. Not that she was intentionally wanting to dehumanise.
Not in the least. She was coming from.
Obviously, she wanted to be a good student and apply the theory, but it's also a way to try to escape the pain of someone else's. Just try and understand it in terms of theoretical context.
Which I think is what we have to guard against. Theories can be very, very useful in all sorts of ways, but if it's not realistic, then we're in trouble.
Dr. Peter, hello.
Oh, yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. That was beautiful. I'm interested to know what with the sort of thoughts that there's no endings. What do we do with this? Because this has happened to you, and but there's so many people that it's happening to that don't have your capabilities and are rendered absolutely useless. And I'm just wondering if you're motivated to do anything with this experience.
Apart from sharing environments like this, to illustrate that really what I think that moment, that experience for me illustrates is that it's entirely possible to have extremely contradictory feelings operating in us at the same time, and that they should both be paid attention to and taken seriously. So the fact that it was really kind of an impossibility that I wouldn't get my passport, the fact that I felt that I wouldn't, and that I couldn't dislodge that feeling, really needs some attention. Would need some attention. If I was my patient, if somebody came with me, I would be going, what? I wouldn't be saying, well, you got your passport, or well, not really likely you won't get your passport. It would be, to me, it would be, what is the experience that experience is emergence from? And that's why kind of towards the end, I kind of think, when I said at the beginning that phenomenology, you can never know really where it starts, for this exercise, well, what was my dad's experience like? And how, not so much what his experience like for him, but how was his experience, what did that mean to his relationship to me? And what did his parents' experience, their experience mean for him? And you know, I think those are useful reflections. Sorry, Amanda, your question was about.
I think I'm just interested because I think it's so important what you're saying, and it just seems, I don't know, you're so capable and so many people aren't, and they're going, I suppose they're going through the same thing but maybe worse, and they don't have the confidence, they don't have the double side of, well, actually it's all going to be okay. I don't know, it just feels quite an important experience and something that was triggered by probably someone that hadn't really thought about it very much, what it meant.
When I first started training, and my very first patient was a young black guy who was insistent that he was being racially abused in the streets of Camden all of the time. And this terrorized him and this, caused him to disable him in all sorts of ways. And he came in one day and told me a story, which, on listening to the story, just couldn't be true. In a kind of physical sense, it couldn't be true. He was saying that this woman was hurling racial abuse at him, and then he went on to say that she was in her house, in her kitchen, across the street. It was this kind of impossibility. And I think, I didn't know then, that's 30 years ago, but now I would be saying, one has to listen really carefully to what this person is saying, and hear them and explore with them what it's like for them to be in that experience, not whether it's true or not. What is it like for you to experience it? And I think people respond to that kind of attention. They respond much more easily to being heard and get the experience of being heard than they do to be told that it couldn't possibly be true or to be told something else. And so, if I'm to say to anybody, this attitude, bring an open attitude of listening and exploration. What did that feel like?
It reminds me of, I'm sure I'm bastardizing it because I don't really know it so well, but like R.D. Laing and how he talked about schizophrenia and psychosis and the importance of meeting it, I guess, on as a like that there's in something which seems nonsensical, where what is the sense in it, and meeting it on the symbolic in that way. I wonder whether that's somewhat similar to what you're saying.
Well, both Del and I trained at the Philadelphia Association and know the Lang story very well. But I do remember the reason why I went there. And I went there because I was working at Mind and I couldn't get counselling for any of the patients of mine. As soon as anybody hears that they were psychotic, the shutters go down. And my thinking at the time was, well, the only way we would understand it was training. The trainers would understand it. Then it was said. And the Philadelphia Association was the only place that I had been interested in staying on psychosis at the time. But that's your point. So the message was, when working with people who are psychotic, then you should work in this kind of way, etc., because X, Y, Z. And that's fine. But I always remember thinking, why don't we work that way with everybody? Why are we, and so, I myself has evolved into thinking, no, actually, this is a much better way of working. with anybody who comes into everybody whether they're psychotic or not wants to listen to and to be heard and to be met with something that is a bit more clear, have some kind of tune. I mean, I think, you know, I think I said it there. I think this is how I work with all my patients. But I think it's for marginalised people, it actually gives it also brings a greater level of accessibility. I was thinking, you know, when we live and work in such a kind of diverse world that we can't possibly know everybody's experience. We can't, you know, and we can't translate it in any particular way. We don't know how people's worlds are. What we can do is be open to appreciating their version of the world.
What do we need to do for that? I just wonder if phenomenology and psychoanalysis is enough.
Well, maybe it's not. It's not the going for a good swim might help as well.
Well, especially what we swim in. It's you know, it's. I was interested in using the word hidden and tacit.
Yeah.
And if what's hidden from us, and what's hidden from us that psychoanalysis can help us reveal, what does psychoanalysis get hidden from? And it seems like, you know, I think you mentioned the social culture earlier. You know, to an extent, we need to look at how we're the moralising that goes on, the kind of ownership of stuff and how that makes people, you know, psychoanalysis can help something that's hidden emerge. Phenomenology, we can be open to stuff, but doing other things, you know, in order to see there's also things that are hidden that can emerge, and there are things that are hidden that can't emerge. Yeah, it seems like for me, tacit is something that's very important kind of knowledge, but we can't put words to it. Whereas the racism we're talking about, I think we can put words to it. They're kept from us, but they're not kept from us by the nature of them. Yeah, like some other form of tacit knowledge might be. They're kept hidden from us from our social, cultural, moralising stuff. Yeah, which psychoanalysis gets caught up with as well.
That's why I like the American pragmatism. Insofar as it, you know, it can open up.
Right.
It can open up the nature of the habits that we form, that we kind of operate by.
Can you say a bit more about American pragmatism? You know?
I'll try.
One person's pragmatism is another.
Yeah. Yes. I suppose it starts for me with the idea. The first idea that really kind of appealed to me was the kind of idea that, you know, what is truth? And truth is really what is convenient at any one cultural moment of time. That is what then is truth. And that shifts and changes all the time. And that was the first thing that I found appealing. The other thing that I found appealing was that, you know, what happens to these truths is that they get kind of embedded in our bodies. We embody them, and they become kind of naturalized. And that's what then becomes tacit in the sense of how you feel, what you then do, how you then operate in the world. And so being able to reflect, well, first of all, appreciate that these are habits. They are habits that can be broken, and we can think differently, and we can find other ways of that anything that we actually believe is really quite unstable. And I think for me, that's really useful in the consulting room, because people come and say, "Oh, you know, I should have done this by now," you know, because they're responding to their idea that they should be married at 25, whatever it is. Well, should you? What does that mean? How do you get that? does it come from? And if you don't want to do that, what do you want to do? How do you want to get there? That's kind of why I like it as an add-on.
No, I think, so there's lots of things you say which I think are really important. I think the pragmatism stuff is very helpful for us because the American pragmatists, I think, they as you said, there's something about how they wanted to know what the practical consequences of these ideas, these theories. And as you say now, I think something to do with time. There's a Rorty makes an argument somewhere that if most of I can't remember it now, so we'll talk about it. But he wants to say that most of the theories that we held 100 years ago, we don't hold anymore. So he says, by implication, all the theories that we hold now, we tend to have understanding of them. So I think there's that idea of time and how things change.
And that is also true of psychoanalysis?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think not only theories, but what we do. There's a question about how stable are they and how likely it is to last another 100 years.
I once read a very interesting book called Melanie Klein in Context. It's a little small book, but it's really about how how her theory of female sexuality came about to be what it is, and is now taken for the gospel amongst Klein and psychoanalysts. The truth of the matter was, she was a woman in whatever it was, 1920s, trying to get into the IPA, and the Institute of Psychoanalysis. And the only way she could get in there is if she got these men on side with her theory. So she had to adjust her theory, to meet their satisfaction. And that became, the Melanie Klein's theory of sexuality, or female sexuality. And I just think, and it could have been something else. If that kind of misogyny wasn't there, it would have been something else. And I think that's true of all sorts of things.
I can't remember which book it was, but there's a comment made in one of the books, one psychoanalyst about Melanie Klein. It says something like, towards the end of her life, she was talking about how much she would have liked to analyse someone from a different culture.
Okay.
Which I just thought that was quite important. There's an admission that people that she sort of worked for, mainly German or British, in a particular time and place. So I guess I'm just saying something about Timothy just wanting to universalize or whatever it is that she said. I want to say something to you as well. I wonder if you could say that if you were in the situation of the past, read section 4, and then thought fine, would not then you'd be in real trouble?
And what kind of trouble would it be in, do you think?
Well, I think it'd be a kind of trouble, I mean, I don't know, but I think it'd be a kind of trouble that's sort of doesn't take into account history and politics and things like that. If you're a person who doesn't take it in, into account.
Can you say more about the fight that you sort of started with the idea that the fight and then your idea was born from that? I was interested to hear more about that.
Oh, right. Okay. So, well, it was really just the form. It was the form of using what I was interested in, what I tried to replicate a little bit was the form of using narrative to illustrate a philosophical point. And this Frederick Douglass, Lewis Gordon uses Frederick Douglass's, a piece of Frederick Douglass's autobiography to illustrate how existentialism works. And it was a sensitive, so it's kind of a, you know, I was using it like that, but the fact, it was a fight that he had, which, oh gosh, called the fight with Covey. The guy was called Covey, overseer. That's what he was, the overseer, and he. Oh God, it's too long and completely off topic. But can I narrow it down? Okay. Frederick Douglass. This guy was regarded as quite unruly. He was only 16 or 17 years of age. He was regarded as unruly, and this overseer, he was sent to this overseer to be broken in the same way that you would break in a oxen, if you like. This guy employed various methods of breaking in the slaves, and he would hide them, and he would ambush them. He would, you know, there was all sorts of like terror, beat them. There were all sorts of ways in which he would do this. And Frederick Douglass decided at one point, he turned and decided that he wasn't going to stand up for it anymore. And the next time he tries to trouble me, I'm going to fight him back. And he fought him back, and he fought him back for about 2 hours. And in the end, the guy got up and left and said, "Get back to your work." But during the fight, how he describes the fight, well, during the fight, they can't, I'm romanticising it a bit, but it's as if they met each other's eyes. And for the first time, he could see that Covey could see that he was a human being. And he could see that Covey knew that he was a human being. And Covey could also see that he could see that he was a human being. And there was this moment which Lewis Gordon, it's that moment really that Lewis Gordon uses to describe the kind of existential process. Does that make any sense?
It's like the master slave.
Yeah.
I was thinking of what you said earlier about, at the start, you said something along the lines of you're supposed to have worked through all this stuff, and then you're thrown by this passport experience, and it just makes me think what changes really, maybe not personally necessarily, but on a wider level as well, what does change? You know?
Well, I suppose I would say it might not show, but I can be quite an anxious person. And what I would say is that years and years of therapy have shown me that not to be afraid of my anxiety. it doesn't go away. When people come and say, "Can you take away my depression?" My answer is no. Well, we can think about it differently. We can have a different relationship to it. And so I suppose things like that, kind of be less. I am less anxious because I think about my anxiety differently. But the idea of magicking away anxiety or any of these kind of feelings that people have doesn't happen. Okay.
Hi, Peter. Hi. Can you hear me there? Can you hear me there, Del? Yeah. It
Yeah,
feels
loud
like
and clear, Tony.
feels like I'm jumping through a window here. It's quite strange. But that description of the fight, it reminded me a bit of psychotherapy itself. It's a bit like finally one human being meets another human being, and they both recognize each other in some way. And there's something very therapeutic about that, isn't there? You know. but when you first mentioned it, you said the conflict or something brings about the emergence as a human subject. You know, that sounds like Lacan to me. You know, so the idea of being a subject. You know, and you know, it kind of links a bit with the habits. Like, as we all know, some people just can't break habits. It's almost like the habit is something existential to them that they have to have, you know. And could you say a little bit about that, about breaking habits, or you know, is it that easy really to change our subjectivity?
I don't suppose it's a question of whether it's easy or not. I think it's I think what's more significant is the realization that it's possible, even if we can't. The idea that it's possible, the idea that there could be another way of being, the idea itself, I think is helpful.
Yeah. And things do shift over time, don't they? Because you know, people don't faint anymore, do they? You know, hysterics used to faint, you know, as they say in the old days. Yeah, but that doesn't happen anymore. So there's something working in the culture, I suppose, that makes us think differently or be differently.
I wonder as fanciful as it is, the idea that as just following what you're saying now, Toby, that Toby's a breaker. He's famous for breaking slates. That's why Frederick Douglass sent it. I wonder if it's very fanciful to think Toby has been a bit like a therapist. You send someone to cure them, to fix them up, to make them respectable. I wonder.
I think that's a danger. Real danger. You know, Tavistock was famous for being, you know, as being, you know, hotbed of colonialism, and the objectives of colonialism, paraphrase this, were, you know, to be in a relationship, to be able to work, and that's what the therapists make you be able to do. But and I do think either wittingly or unwittingly, a lot of people certainly operate as if they're trying to make people do things, or get people to do things that are really about their own knowledge.
That's instead of the NHS today, some of the things you have to measure are whether something's working, whether measures see how to fit into what other people think is healthy. And if the environment, if the culture is toxic, how do you fit into that? If you know, it might be something that's not right for the person at all. Fit into something which makes them just out of shape.
But it's ironic, as I read it, you know, that the original psychoanalytic project was really quite a radical attempt to kind of destabilise the idea of having to conform to social norms. That kind of disappeared in the England.
Ducks on the wall. Yeah, you have to fit in with the ducks.
Ducks on the wall.
Yeah, you have to fly the same way as the other ducks, otherwise there's something wrong with you.
I'm not sure if Del, you were saying earlier, like it depends what we're swimming in. It made me think of what Tony was saying about like hysteria as a symptom which kind of spread around, and also the anxiety that you referred to in the passport of you're swimming in a culture where not only racism is occurring, as well as on the topic of conversational, like cultural experience is heightened a lot. For example, maybe like socioeconomic might have been pushed down a bit and racism might have gone up a little bit, for example. And how, in that sense, the anxiety that you experienced is, I guess it's almost what you were saying, like there's no surprise that after working through all of your stuff through the years that you've been practicing, that it still arises in a way. And I just get thoughts about how psychoanalysis, I guess, maybe is meant to tend to certain things might loosen. And I imagine that lots of habits in your life might have changed naturally and things might have loosened and gone somewhere, but some things remain.
And it depends, you know, it's like, I thought afterwards, you know, this was kind of the feelings that I was having, you know, was, you know, it was on the back of the Windrush, that scenario, it was really big in the news.
Yeah.
Now, and I often wondered that, had that not been in the news, right, what would my reaction have been? Would it have been different? Would I have just been perplexed? And, you know, gone, what these silly buggers doing, you know, or ignored it altogether. Do you know, would it have had the same kind of meaning? I imagine not, because it was so full, it was so much in the air at the time. Even though I knew full well that myself and my immediate family weren't in the same position as many of the people on the Windrush, but you know, just all that stuff was in the air. And it was partly a response to that, I imagine.
But I was just thinking that because as an immigrant, I have had also to fill in forms about my mum and my dad and my grandparents. But as a Swedish white woman, I just think, of course they want me to stay. I don't really have to fill this in hardly until Brexit. So again, that's what's happening in the world. Suddenly I was like, ooh. Now I have to actually apply to be here. So I think we are influenced by what's happening around us and time changing.
Suddenly it's more overt, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
the racism suddenly comes back much to the surface. Was there.
Until then, I had been like a high-class immigrant. And suddenly I was down with the rest of them. You know, having to fill in forms. It was a bit like that. I never had to think about it. I was just, I'm Swedish, I could do what I want. It was like that. So I do think it influences how we look at things.
It's so important to really, this connection that we have, that we're just not. I mean, I sometimes think with psychoanalysis that the emphasis on stuff that just arises in us, that is like innate. Freudian stories and so on. But our existence in the world, we're so subject to it, you know, and our own subjectivity created in a kind of interaction between our own responses and our own experiences of ourselves and others responding to it, just like the encounter between COVID and our experience of the world. Is why we're born.
There's a history, and it's important about parents and grandparents because you sort of inherit that history of trauma, perhaps not through words, not necessarily through brain, but it's embodied in you as it kind of comes down the generational experiences. Sometimes in physical ways, you know, so your parents, well, if your grandmother has suffered malnutrition, and it comes down the generations, it's inherited through the generations that those things, and also other traumas, emotional traumas, not necessarily words, that come down, so they're embodied and embedded in you, whether you know it or not. So culture is something that's lived. It's not just that's what a lot of our theories forget. That it's a whole. We're just in the world, but there's so many things coming down from us.
I keep finding myself caught up in this idea. I don't think you put it this way, but of your, I don't know, maybe analytic knowledge and the almost like an armour which abandon you at a moment where you there's something about that quite, I'm sort of captivated by. I don't seem to think a bit beyond that, but keep imagining, like, I think there's this idea of feet don't fail me now, and I think psychoanalysis don't fail me now, and do you summon it back? Do you, how do you maintain your composure and not reveal this panic that sounds like you carry for several days?
Well, that's, I think, but I think that is part of the point. It was just several days. There are people who I can imagine people having the same experience and that ruining their life. It doesn't recover. And I think it's the psychoanalytic armour, if you like, that enabled me to recover it, even though at the moment, right up until gave me forms back. Right up until that moment.
Even the idea of the armoury, though, I'm not sure. I think that there is something of, maybe psychoanalysis, maybe it softens you up more. Maybe it allows you to feel more. Maybe you're suffering more. And I think that it's very different to think what was a couple of days, lots for it. I think, of course, in the context makes a lot of sense. But that's very different from, being apparently fine and not being able to sleep and be panicked and being all over them. I think there's something about being able to feel and think about it.
So in a way, are we telling clients, I just wonder what psychoanalysis might be revealing or hiding, are we saying to clients, it can save you, or it's revealing the truth? I don't know.
I say to people when they come, and almost everybody who ever comes will say, if it's going to work, or will you cure my depression, or will you get rid of my anxiety? That's almost everything. Well, they come because they're coming for something, understandably. And I always say, it's kind of mantra, if you like. It's a version of, well, what I'm interested in is the kind of life you want to lead and how you're going to get there. And that will be the conversation that we have. So it's not really telling them anything. But go on with this journey.
But they want to live the life without racism.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk about that then.
How are they going to get there?
And how are they going to get there? But I think, well, more importantly, I think we want it like, what's it like living with it? And how can you make a difference to your life despite it?
That's interesting, like conversation starter or like therapy process starter, because it opens up a lot, but I imagine lots of the goalposts and what one desires changes. Anyway, it does change along the way completely.
It's the old chestnuts that what people say they want, why they come. It's not the reason why they want. They want what they want and not why they come. It always changes over the course of the conversation.
Do you think psychoanalysis can also lead to a form of politics?
Well, I see politics in everything. So I think the whole the psychoanalytic project is a political project. Also, are its theories of political invention, which suit a particular moment of time, a bit like the decline that was describing. Even further back, Freud, Ferenczi, and Jung were battling out all of this kind of stuff with each other, and the ones that forensic got kicked out, and nobody heard a word from him for 50 years. And now you hear people talking about, oh, he was the start of subjectivity. He was the first, he was really onto it in 1903, and I think he probably was. Well, that's not the psychoanalytic story I grew up with. It was a different one. So I do think I don't think there's anything outside of political activities. Really.
Somehow there is even a sense that psychoanalysis was born out of racism. Isn't there this story of Freud's father Freud witnessing his father being humiliated for being a Jew and having to step off the pavement into the road?
I don't know that story, but there's no question in my mind.
Maybe I'm making it up. There is a story.
Freud's attention to the other, which is what it's all about, was an exploration for him of why our strong experience of being a Jew in this history. I mean, I've heard it described as the Jews in Europe as the blacks, the Jews in Europe as the blacks in Europe. And in many ways, that's really meaningful, because it's, and I think Freud's search was a quest to work out what this is all about. Really, the bottom line. I mean, there was all sorts of other issues which anti-Semitism encroached on the production of psychoanalytic theory too, because it had to be a universal idea, precisely because he didn't want everybody to be saying, oh, this is a Jewish thing. So he had to fashion it as a universal idea, even though so there's all
and of course Freud did say, didn't he say that when he's talking about religion, that it was the future of an illusion? So he wasn't particularly religious himself, was he?
No, I don't think he said he wasn't at all.
Yeah.
But he was very, very interested in what religion does. In Moses' monotheism is a rich exploration of how groups form around, in this particular case, religious identities. And his provocation to other Jews was to say in that book that Moses wasn't a Jew, Moses was an Egyptian. The rabbis were going mental at the time.
Yeah.
Can't say that, you can't say that. He left it as his dying legacy. So he was very interested in what makes human beings group together and do what they do with one another.
Okay, well, we've grouped together today, so Peter, thank you very much for a very beautiful talk.
Thank you.
In a difficult area. Thank you very much indeed. One thing, I'm very struck what you said about person, was it one human being to another human being? There's somebody said that. You said it just came out in the conversation.
I think it might have been the story about Kobe.
Yes, and there's something, I think it's just that you haven't mentioned, but only indirectly, maybe in phenomenology, and that is that my own experience, my experience when I was in the train was pretty awful. Yeah, I found quite ostracised by it, and I probably did that to myself as well. But soon after, I met you somewhere. Somewhere, just in passing. I don't know what you said, right? But it's how you said it. And it was one human being to another human being. And that meant so much to me. Thank you.
No.
And it's that's what changed the habits.
You're right.
Okay. Our next speaker is in May, and it's Robert Bashara, who's talking about Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis as a colonial project.
Cool.
Yeah. So,
Cool.
beginning of May. So thanks very much again, Peter, and it's our break time.